Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we are going to take another deep dive into today's top news for law and policy. We've got a lot to cover today, a lot of interesting developments.
Yeah, a lot of stuff going on and from quite a range of sources. We've got everything from sort of like the legal blogs to some mainstream outlets and some more niche publications.
Well, let's jump right in. I think one of the more interesting things at the top of the news today is that New York is again considering banning non-competes for most employees.
Yeah, this is kind of a recurring theme, right? They tried this last year.
Right. It passed the legislature, but then the governor vetoed it.
Right.
And now they're back with a new proposal. So what's going on here? Are non-competes about to be a thing of the past in New York?
Well, not entirely, it seems like. This time around, they're still carving out an exception for what they're calling highly compensated employees.
Okay, so if this bill passes in its current form, non-competes would still be allowed for folks who are making a certain amount of money or more. So if this does become law, what's the bigger picture here? How's this going to change things for employees and businesses in New York?
Well, for employees, it could mean greater job mobility and maybe they'd have more leverage when it comes to negotiating salaries and benefits. They wouldn't have to worry about being locked out of working for a competitor.
So this could be a big win for employees. But what about the businesses? They must have some concerns about this.
Yeah, for sure. They're probably thinking about how they're going to retain their top talent and protect their confidential information if they can't rely on these non-competes anymore.
So this could really shake things up in the New York labor market. I'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
Definitely.
All right, let's switch gears and talk about Michigan auto insurance. There's a perspective out there that Cure Auto Insurance might not be all it's cracked up to be. What's the issue there?
Yeah, so there are reports circulating about some, well, let's say questionable practices with Cure. The biggest red flag seems to be this thing they're calling a deposit. Apparently, they tack on a 25% deposit on top of your regular premium.
A deposit. For car insurance, that's not something you hear about very often.
Exactly. That right there is a pretty big sign that something might be fishy. And it doesn't stop there. There are also allegations that Cure might be, let's just say, overly aggressive when it comes to scrutinizing claims.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's talk about Cure questioning the recommendations made by doctors and even outright refusing to authorize payments for surgeries.
Okay, so if you get into an accident and need medical treatment, Cure might not be so quick to cover the costs. That's a pretty big concern for policyholders.
Absolutely. And it gets even worse. There are reports that they're actually advising people to underinsure.
Wait, advising people to take on more risk? That seems counterintuitive.
Right. You'd think an insurance company would want you to be fully covered. But apparently Cure is telling people to go with lower coverage limits because it'll save them money on premiums.
But wouldn't that leave those drivers in a really vulnerable position?
You got it. They might save a few bucks up front, but if they get into a serious accident, they could be on the hook for huge medical bills.
So the message here is clear. If you're looking for car insurance in Michigan, it's probably a good idea to steer clear of Cure Auto Insurance.
I think that's a safe bet.
Okay, let's move on to the Supreme Court. The SCOTUS morning read from March 18th had a few interesting tidbits.
Definitely. There was a report in the New York Times about something that happened down in Texas that I think is pretty significant.
What happened?
A midwife and one of her associates were arrested for allegedly performing abortions. And what makes this really stand out is that it looks like these are the first arrests of this kind since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade.
So we're starting to see the real-world consequences of that landmark decision play out.
Exactly. And this case out of Texas really highlights the shifting legal landscape surrounding abortion. It's a whole new ballgame now.
Were there any other noteworthy SCOTUS developments that day?
Yeah, there was a piece about a bill in California that's aimed at bringing back protections for wetlands.
So it seems like there's still a lot of action happening at the state level when it comes to environmental issues.
Absolutely. States are definitely stepping up to fill the void left by the federal government in some areas.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about immigration. For folks who are trying to navigate the, let's be honest, pretty complicated process of applying for immigration benefits, what are some common mistakes they should be aware of?
I mean, it's really easy to make a mistake when you're dealing with all the paperwork and deadlines. But some of the most common ones we see are pretty simple things. Incorrect dates, missing signatures on forms, not including all the required documents. Those kinds of oversights can really trip people up.
And those seemingly minor mistakes can have big consequences, right?
Oh, absolutely. They can lead to delays in processing your application, or even worse, your application could be denied outright.
So the takeaway here is to be meticulous. Double check everything, make sure you've got all your ducks in a row before you submit anything.
Couldn't agree more. Attention to detail is key in these situations.
All right, let's move on to Texas.
Hmm.
There was a piece about legal protection after a motorcycle accident on Texas highways. Now, I'm not a biker myself, but I know those accidents can be pretty bad.
Yeah, no doubt. Motorcycle accidents are no joke. You're out there completely exposed, so the risk of serious injury is high.
So if you do find yourself in that unfortunate situation, what are the most important things to do?
First and foremost, get medical attention. Your health is the top priority. But you also want to make sure you document the accident scene as thoroughly as possible. Take photos, get witness statements, that kind of thing.
And I imagine having a good lawyer on your side is pretty important too.
Definitely. If you're looking to get compensated for your injuries and losses, a lawyer who specializes in motorcycle accidents can be a huge asset. They know the ins and outs of the law and can help you navigate the whole process.
Okay, let's talk about the FCC. They've been making some moves lately.
Yeah, they've been pretty busy. One thing that caught my eye was their decision to set the effective dates for some new rules on wireless emergency alerts.
What are those all about?
So basically, these rules are designed to give alert originators more flexibility when it comes to sending out WEAs. They'll now have the option to send alerts silently.
Silent alerts. That's interesting. Why would you want to do that?
Well, think about it. There are certain situations where a loud, jarring alert might not be the best option. Maybe it would cause panic or even put people in danger. A silent alert would be a more discreet way to get the message out.
Makes sense. So these new rules give authorities more options when it comes to emergency communication.
Exactly. And the rules also say that wireless carriers need to have the capability to transmit these silent alerts. So it's not just up to the originators. The carriers have to be on board too.
Okay, so it's a coordinated effort to improve the WEA system.
Right.
Anything else going on at the FCC?
Well, FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks announced he's stepping down this spring.
So I'll have to fill that vacancy.
Yep. And another thing, the FCC has launched a new council.
Oh, yeah? What for?
It's called the Council for National Security, and it sounds like their main focus is going to be on threats from China.
Interesting. So the FCC is getting into the national security game now.
Well, FCC Chair Brendan Carr has been talking a lot about the need to be vigilant when it comes to China, particularly with regard to communications technology and infrastructure. So I guess this council is part of that effort.
All right, moving on. The EPA has also been in the news lately because they're planning to take another look at greenhouse gas regulations.
Yeah, this is definitely one to watch. It's sparking quite a bit of controversy, as you might expect.
What's the background here?
Well, it's worth remembering that the Trump EPA was also looking to re-examine these regulations, specifically the endangerment finding, which is basically the EPA's determination that greenhouse gases are a danger to public health and welfare.
And that finding is based on, a whole lot of scientific evidence.
Right, a ton of evidence. But the Trump administration, and now it seems the current administration, wants to take another look at it.
And what are the experts saying about the likelihood of this reconsideration actually leading to a change in the endangerment finding?
Well, most legal experts think it would be a really tough uphill battle to overturn the endangerment finding. The scientific evidence supporting it is pretty overwhelming.
So this could be a long and drawn-out process with a lot of legal wrangling.
Yeah, that's a safe bet.
All right, let's talk about a study that came out about changes in minor consent laws.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. The study looked at how laws around minors consenting to sexual health services have been changing.
And what did they find?
It seems like there's a trend toward giving young people more autonomy when it comes to their sexual health. More and more states are allowing minors to access certain services without parental consent.
So this reflects a broader societal shift in how we think about the rights of minors, particularly when it comes to healthcare.
Absolutely. This is definitely a topic that's evolving, and the legal landscape is changing right along with it.
All right, let's turn our attention to Biglaw. It seems like they're facing increasing pressure from certain figures associated with the Trump administration.
Yeah, it's definitely been heating up. There have been some pretty strong statements coming from folks like Steve Bannon, essentially saying they want to put these firms out of business.
Wow, that's pretty aggressive. But are these just empty threats, or is there something more to it?
Well, Above the Law and the Washington Post editorial board have both published pieces about this, and they seem to be taking it pretty seriously.
So there's a sense that this is a real and growing threat.
Yeah, I think so. And a U.S. senator even came out in defense of some of the Trump administration's executive orders that target these firms.
So this is definitely something that Biglaw is going to have to contend with. Are there any specific actions being taken against these firms?
Well, there are reports that the EEOC is conducting a probe into the DEI practices of about 20 law firms.
And what about the firms themselves? How are they responding to all this pressure?
Some of them have been seen scrubbing diversity language from their websites.
Wow, so they're really feeling the heat.
It seems that way.
Okay, let's talk about the Trump administration's immigration policies. What's the latest there?
Well, the administration has moved to dismiss lawsuits that are challenging immigration laws in Iowa and Oklahoma.
So they're really doubling down on those policies.
Yeah, it looks that way. And there have also been some high-profile incidents involving ICE.
Like what?
Well, a Palestinian student at Columbia University was arrested by ICE after participating in pro-Palestinian protests.
And that's not all, right?
No, another student had their visa revoked and ended up self-deporting back to India.
So it seems like ICE is really cracking down on students who are politically active.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of controversy surrounding the use of the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador.
What's going on there?
Well, it seems like the administration's trying to use this act to justify deportations, but there's a lot of debate about whether it's actually legal in these cases.
So the legal basis for these deportations is being challenged.
Exactly. And Noah Feldman, a law professor, has argued that this is a pretty weak legal argument.
So it sounds like these deportations could end up being tied up in court for a while.
That's very possible.
Right, let's switch gears again and talk about AI. It seems like AI is making its way into just about every field these days, and the legal profession is no exception.
You're telling me, according to Smokeball's 2025 report, the use of AI by small law firms has almost doubled.
Wow, so that's a pretty significant increase. It sounds like AI is becoming more and more mainstream in the legal world.
Yeah, for sure. But it's interesting, there was also a survey that showed a lot of people in the general public have this idea that AI is going to be doing most legal work by the end of 2025.
That seems a little optimistic, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so too. AI is definitely making inroads into the legal profession, but it's not going to replace lawyers anytime soon.
What are some other notable AI developments in the legal field?
Well, the AAA has teamed up with Dioptra, a startup that uses GenAI for contract review.
So AI is being used to streamline and automate some of the more tedious legal tasks.
Exactly. And Harvey, which is an AI platform for lawyers, is getting ready to roll out something they're calling agentic workflows.
What are those?
They're basically AI systems that are able to plan and adapt their actions more independently within legal workflows.
So they're giving these AI systems more autonomy. That's pretty interesting.
Definitely. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Okay, let's talk about elections. There's always something going on in the world of elections.
Always. In Redondo Beach, California, they just elected some new leaders using ranked choice voting.
So that's an example of a different voting method being used in a real-world election.
Yep. But in Shasta County, California, they're having some legal issues over a proposed ballot measure that's supposed to reform elections.
So there's still a lot of debate about how best to run elections.
For sure. And we're seeing similar issues pop up in other countries, too. In Romania and Brazil, there have been some candidate disqualifications and legal challenges ahead of their upcoming elections.
So these concerns about election integrity are global.
Absolutely. And even here in the U.S., there are still problems. In Wisconsin, some voters got inaccurate election info in the mail.
That's not good.
No, it just goes to show that there are still vulnerabilities in our election system. And the fallout from past elections continues.
Oh, yeah. What's the latest there?
Newsmax agreed to pay $40 million to settle Smartmatic's defamation lawsuit over the 2020 election.
So that whole saga is finally coming to an
At
end.
least for Newsmax.
What else is happening on the election front?
There's a bipartisan mail ballot bill being considered in Nevada.
That's encouraging. It's nice to see both sides of the aisle working together on something as important as elections.
Definitely. And New Jersey has a new primary ballot design, but it looks like that might face some legal challenges.
So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yep. And a consent decree was just entered in a voter registration dispute in Montana.
Okay, so lots of moving pieces on the election front.
Definitely keeping things interesting.
What about the Department of Justice? Have they been involved in any election-related cases lately?
Yeah, they decided to drop a lawsuit that the Biden administration had filed against Alabama over election security.
So they're backing off on that one.
Yep. But on the other hand, Interim U.S. Attorney Ed Martin has opened an election fraud unit.
So it seems like the DOJ is taking a mixed approach to election-related issues.
That's one way to put it.
Okay, let's wrap things up with a quick rundown of some other notable legal developments.
All right, sounds good. The Supreme Court turned down an appeal in that big $1.6 billion BMC IBM case.
Remind me, what was that all about?
It was about whether intellectual property law can be used as an exception to antitrust rules. The lower court said yes, and the Supreme Court decided not to get involved.
So that ruling stands.
Yep. There have also been some developments with competition law and policy in Georgia and Estonia.
So those countries are making moves in the antitrust space.
And the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals released their case summaries for February 2025.
Always interesting to see what the courts are up to.
Definitely. There's also been a lot of discussion about when the police are allowed to take your cell phone during an arrest.
Yeah, that's a tricky issue.
It is. It all goes back to that Riley v. California case, which set some limits on warrantless cell phone searches.
Right, that was a landmark decision.
For sure. And speaking of landmark decisions, a federal jury awarded a huge amount of money to 2 men who were wrongfully convicted.
That's a big win for those guys.
Yeah, it really shows the power of the legal system to right wrongs.
What else?
The Supreme Court of Canada rejected an appeal in Saskatchewan v. Metis Nation.
And what was that one about?
It was about the government's duty to consult with Indigenous peoples.
Okay. So that's a pretty important issue in Canada.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And a judge in the Bronx, Jeffrey M. Zimmerman, resigned amid a probe into allegations that he interfered with attorney-client privilege.
Wow, that's not something you hear about every day.
No. And a judge in Philadelphia hit the DA's office with sanctions because of a dispute with an ex-prosecutor.
So there's some drama going on in the legal world, too?
Always. Ninth Circuit Judge Sandra Ikuda is going to be taking senior status.
So she's basically semi-retiring.
That's right. And there's a lot of debate about Delaware's recent corporate law amendments.
What's the issue there?
Some people think the changes will make things clearer, while others worry that they'll restrict the Chancery Court.
So it's a matter of perspective.
I guess so. And in Georgia, where they're trying to reform tort law, Walmart is fighting back against a $1 million injury verdict.
So they're not going down without a fight.
Nope. And a mass torts lawyer from New Jersey is going to be leading the Depo-Provera MDL.
So that's a big case.
It is.
Yeah.
And Universal Music Group is trying to get a lawsuit from a rapper dismissed.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. There's also been a lot of talk about how to measure the performance of legal departments.
So they're trying to figure out how to quantify the value of legal work.
Pretty much.
Okay, what else?
There's a case involving arbitration in Bogota and a court in Gujarat, India, that's dealing with a distribution agreement.
So that's an example of international legal issues.
And California's age-appropriate design code is facing some constitutional challenges.
So that law is in hot water.
Yep. And if you're doing business in China, you need to be really careful about their rules on personal data export compliance.
So that's something to keep in mind.
Definitely. And the Trump tariffs are still having an impact on federal contractors.
So those tariffs are still being felt.
They are. And the National Advertising Division is cracking down on celebrity and influencer marketing.
So they're trying to make sure that kind of marketing is transparent?
Exactly. Over in the UK, they've published some draft regulations about exemptions for pension fund clearing obligations.
Okay, so that's something that's on their radar.
And they've also got some draft legislation aimed at making UK capital markets regulation more efficient.
So they're trying to streamline things.
Yep. If you're an employer in California, you need to be aware of the rules about personnel files.
So that's something for California employers to keep in mind.
Definitely. And just a reminder that NYDFS compliance notifications are due by April 15th.
So don't forget about that.
The FDA has finished its pre-market consultation for food made with cultured pork fat cells.
So that's lab-grown meat.
That's right. The International Bar Association is happy about the arrest of a former Philippine president.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. And if you're dealing with layoffs in a unionized workplace in Ontario, Canada, there are some specific legal things you need to know.
So that's something for Canadian employers to be aware of.
And the backlash against DEI is creating some legal risks for employers.
So that's something to watch out for.
Definitely. The legal status of U.S. territories is a really complicated issue.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
It is. And trusts can be used as qualified purchasers for investments in private securities.
Okay, that's still to know.
The Ninth Circuit overturned a probation sentence for a transgender hacker.
So that's a pretty significant case.
It is. And the Kentucky Supreme Court ruled that a ban on public employee union payroll deductions is unconstitutional.
Wow, that's a big one.
Yep.
Well, that was a whirlwind tour of the legal and policy landscape.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many different areas are being impacted by these
I
developments.
know, right?
Oh.
Everything from labor law to environmental regulations to the latest in AI technology.
It's a lot to keep up with, but it's also incredibly fascinating to see how all these different pieces fit together.
Definitely. It's like a giant puzzle. And every day we get a few more pieces.
And trying to figure out how those pieces fit together is what makes it so interesting.
Absolutely.
So what do you think? Are there any overarching themes or trends that are driving these changes in the legal and policy landscape? What's the big picture here?
That's a great question. I think we're seeing a real push and pull between forces that want to maintain the status quo and forces that are pushing for change.
So it's a battle between tradition and innovation.
In a way, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And this is playing out in so many different areas, from technology to social issues to economic policy. It's really a fascinating time to be following these developments.
It certainly is, and it makes you wonder what the legal and policy landscape will look like in 5 or 10 years. Will we see even more dramatic changes?
Only time will tell. But I have a feeling things are only going to get more interesting.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the legal and policy news.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
And to all our listeners, keep those legal minds sharp, and we'll see you next time.